So now let's fit the system. Every installation is going to be different, so I'm just going to go through some of the considerations I went through. The first thing to do is find out where the system is going to connect to the engine. And that's usually where an oil switch, oil sender, or an oil sending tube to a live gauge goes. And that is normally, but not necessarily, close to the oil filter. So I actually consulted my workshop manual to find where that was, and you'll see that in just a minute. The other thing was it needs space, and my engine is a V engine, and V's are wider at the top than at the bottom, so I had to go digging because there was really no room on the surface between the undersurface of the hood and the top of the engine. And in any event, I actually didn't want this to be showing too much, wanted it to be fairly discreet. No surprise, the oil switch was by the oil filter, but it's just as well I did consult the workshop manual because there's two things plugged in there and I wasn't sure what was what, but it turns out the one with the black arrow is the oil switch, the other happens to be an oil temperature gauge. And you can see from the picture where it actually was. It's a kind of weird picture, so I had to mark up and right to get some orientation on it. Because I found the oil switch next to the oil filter on the right side of the vehicle, I knew that I needed to install my system on the right side too. I lifted up the air filter, and underneath this is what I found. And it's quite a good space to put the system, I thought, but there are some things to be careful of. You can see where the oil filter is, so that's where my outlet is going to go to. But there's an alternator there and an exhaust manifold. The alternator has vents on the outside, that's the exhaust cooling air, and I didn't want to block that. But the exhaust manifold gets very hot and I wanted to keep the system away from that. So you can see in the next picture how I installed it. So here you see the system as I installed it. You can see I have the storage tank high so it doesn't impede the exhaust air from the alternator, and I've got the solenoid valve low to keep it out the way of the exhaust. I guess heat rises, so it should be okay down there, and in fact this picture tends to foreshorten the distance. It's quite away from the exhaust manifold. Here you can see the installed lower components. My assembly was quite long, partly because the metric adapter I had to use was quite long too. That was supplied with a kit by the way. If I had run out of room, then there are a number of fittings that I would have used to get round corners, either on their own or in combination, and you can see examples of those on the right. I'm not going to spend much time on this picture or the next one. I've just inserted them here just in case there's anybody who's not familiar with the different fittings and the way to install them. And now we come to the electrical side of things. I've lived and worked as an automotive electrical engineer around Motown, near where I live, and around the world. And in the English-speaking world at least, there's a four-letter F word that you never speak about in the auto industry, and that's spelled F-I-R-E. And if you have to talk about it, you call it a thermal event. And most thermal events on cars are initiated by electrical malfunctions, so we need to avoid them where we can. And in this particular installation, we have to crimp the short wires that are on the solenoid valve to the extension wire that is provided in the kit, and we need to make good crimps, and you can't do that with pliers. You need a proper tool to do that, and all crimps should be able to withstand a 15-pound pull test, so give them a good tug when you've done them. Also make sure there are no errant wire strands poking out of the crimp barrel that might short to ground. One of the wires that goes to the solenoid is always live. It's always live when you're driving, it's always live when the car is sitting in your garage. So please make sure it's properly fused using the fuse that's supplied in the kit. There are two fuses supplied in the kit, one a mini fuse, common on American vehicles, and the other fuse is often called an ATC or an ATO or a Euro fuse, but use the tapped fuse that's in the kit. Keep the wires away from heat sources. The underhood temperature in a car is about 135 C, and the insulation will be less tough. It's especially important, therefore, not to pull wires tightly over rough or sharp edges. And do use the cable ties provided to support that wire as often as possible. Also use your own judgment. If you think your wire needs more protection in your application, then use something as I did, like split convolute tubing, which happened to match the other wire protection in the car too. If you've got a car with a lot of dress up or bling, then you can get split convolute tubing, which is chrome plated, or looks chrome plated at least, and of course that reflects heat and gives even more protection. This picture just shows that split convolute tubing routing towards the fuse box, which is under the cover at the bottom left of this picture. Installing the controller and wiring the solenoid to a fuse is probably the most variable part of this whole installation from car to car, so I'll try and go over the more common parts here. In case anyone looks too closely at this picture, I ought to say that this car has about 5 fuse boxes, electrical centers, power distribution boxes, whatever you want to call them, and I went to the closest one, which didn't happen to have a convenient always live place where I could attach the wire from the solenoid, and so I added an inline fuse, and as a result I had the tapped fuse that was provided with the kit over to connect to the controller, but that's unusual. The controller, if you can get it close to the fuse box, is at very little risk of any short circuits, because if you keep that wiring short, it shouldn't have any possibility of getting shorted out. To find the always live and live only with ignition on fuses that you're going to tap into, use a circuit tester. A circuit tester, if you don't have one, is a useful tool and inexpensive. It has an alligator clip that goes to ground and a probe, which when you touch something live will light a light within the handle. So probe first for always live fuses, and when you find the one you want to use, probably a 15 amp because that's what's supplied in the kit, then remove that fuse and probe the sockets of that the fuse went into and find the side that's live. That will be the supply side, and you want to tap off the other side, the load side, so that establishes that for the always live, and then you need to do the same thing with the fuse that you're looking for to find a live when there is only ignition. In case it's not clear on whatever you're viewing it on, controller as I have it mounted here has 3 terminals, and they're labeled, or I've labeled them at least, ground, solenoid and live with ignition, and so you're going to have to find somewhere to get a ground from. There are ring terminals in the kit, and I crimped a wire onto one of the terminals here and crimped the other end of that onto a ring terminal, and I used the same screw that I used to mount the controller to also ground the left-hand contact. At this stage it's worth testing the electrical system, so really you need an assistant to switch on the ignition, and that person needs to know how to do that without actually starting the car. When you do switch on the ignition, there's quite a lot of clicking of other relays going on usually, and so it's worth grabbing the solenoid and then having the assistant power up the ignition. When you grab that solenoid, just in case that assistant does make a mistake and turn the car, do make sure you're out of the way of any belts or other moving items that might start moving. You should then be able to feel and perhaps hear the solenoid valve actuate. And then wait 30 seconds, because after about 30 seconds you should feel the solenoid valve de-energize. You can add air to the system before firing it up for the first time, and you may need to add it later on too, because you could have accidentally, for example, leave the ignition on and depleted the pressure in the system, or you may have purposely done so because during an oil change you want to get rid of all the oil that's in the whole system. Before adding air, if the system has been used before, then do check that the tank is indeed totally empty by leaving the ignition on for about 30 seconds. When you add the air, you need to pressurize the tank but to about 10 to 20 psi, and be very careful because it's such a small tank compared with what you're used to when filling a tire that it will pressurize very quickly.